All right, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage Ty Colman. It's great to have Ty here. He's going to help us demystify carbon emissions accounting, boil it all down in layman's terms for those of us who are probably more toward the beginning of our sustainability journey rather than further along it. We'll then segue to Paul Herendeen for his terrific case study example. Ty, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Fantastic. Appreciate it. Quick raise of hands. Who has developed a scope 1 and 2 inventory? Very good. Who's done scope 3? Who wants to come up here and do this? Excellent. So we're going to go through a few examples, break this down into the component parts of how we develop the data for a scope 1 and 2 inventory. That's really our focus here today. The goal is to establish a strong foundation for scope 1 and 2 emissions accounting. That's the foundation really for any organization. Ensure those accounting practices meet the greenhouse gas protocol. Consider the approaches to take now that inventory and reduce over time. And then the last is hear what's going on in the market. So we're going to do that with Greenhouse Gas Inventory 101. We'll go into planning emission reduction activities, and then we'll wrap it up with that case study. This slide, if you haven't seen this before, I highly encourage you to jump into WWF, our friends over there who developed this many years ago and put this out. It's the difference between hitting 1.5 degrees Celsius and hitting 2 degrees Celsius warming as a planet. There's been a lot of discussion on that already today, so I'm not, and with people much smarter than I am, so I'm not going to belabor this. But the big thing is reducing our emissions, achieving 1.5 degree warming is the goal and should be the goal to mitigate the worst effects. And so we do that first by accounting for our emissions. And that accounting is done with a framework. Ooh, that got interesting. With a framework called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has been around for 20 some years, started in 2001, and it helps us apply a framework for how the emissions are generated within our organizations and how they're bucketed or accounted for. So if you haven't done this before, scope 1 is going to be the emissions that you burn on site or in your vehicles or your operations, and the fugitive emissions from things like your HVAC systems, okay, on-site owned operations. Scope 2 is going to be your electricity or other purchased energy like district heating or district cooling, right? This is what we would bucket scope 1 and 2 really as your operational emissions. And then scope 3 is your value chain. It is everything else. And for credit unions, a lot of that's going to be in your investments category. So the things that you make investments, the money that you lend out for auto mortgages, for auto loans, for mortgages, other investments into public and private entities, it all needs to be accounted for. And this framework allows us to do that, gives us some tools to do it. And then some other frameworks like PCAF are used to further differentiate and give us some guidance around it. All right. Today, as a 101, we're going to focus on scope 1 and 2 only and really dive into what that looks like. So when we're developing an inventory, I like to break it down into 4 simple steps. First, identify the emission sources. Where in your operations are you producing emissions? Collect the activity data, things like the kilowatt hours consumed, the gallons of gasoline, the therms of natural gas. Apply emissions factors to that. I think of emissions factors like a currency conversion. We take euros, we take yen, we convert that all into a common currency like a dollar, okay? Same thing happens in emissions accounting, except here we call it a metric ton or a unit of carbon dioxide equivalent, CO2e. So you're gonna see that in a few of the slides here in just a second. And then the last is we aggregate this data. We sum it up by the various resources, by the various categories or scopes, and make that available to our internal and external stakeholders. Okay, sounds pretty simple. And in scope 1 and 2, it really is. So there's not a lot of complexity here. And I'm going to walk through a really brief example of that, looking at a regional credit union. Okay. Could be the engineering team, the ops team, maybe the real estate team that has helped define what the emissions sources are. So they've helped us understand that they have a vehicle fleet. Okay, so we know we got gasoline, or maybe it's diesel in those vehicles. We know we have that. We have fuels for office heating and water heating. Okay, maybe natural gas in most cases. And then we have refrigerants. We have HVAC systems that are going to help cool our facilities as well. Those leak and produce emissions into the atmosphere. And so we need to account for those as well. So our ops team has helped us define those as scope 1 emissions. We also undoubtedly are consuming electricity. Okay, that's going to be in our scope 2 side. So we have purchased electricity, and in this case, we have district heating. Last but not least, we have some of these scope 3 categories just to round it out, things like purchased goods and services, business travel, employee commuting, and use of the sold products. In this example, we're not going to go into that much here, but just to round it out so you can see how that might translate to a regional credit union. Now, the next step, so that was step 1. The next step is the activity data. So these are the things you're going to see in the bottom of the screen. So our activity data for fuels is going to be things like the company fuel card. How much was purchased? Could be a dollar amount, could be an actual quantity, right? We can use that in the analysis here. Utility bills, therms, MMBTU. Same from landlord. They may be able to provide us that same level of information within, depending upon the landlord-tenant operations there and where your data is coming from. And last but not least is going to be HVAC service records. Could come from the landlord, could come direct from vendors, but that information is going to be very, very valuable there too. And then on the scope 2, utility bills, landlord bills, and data center, maybe that co-location data center provider can give you those kilowatt hour values, right? Well, again, we're going to hold on scope 3. So that's going to give us now the first 2 steps. We understand where our sources are, and we've been able to dig into the activity data that's going to be provided to us. The next step, emissions factors. So we need to take all of that activity data we just discussed and convert that into our common unit. We find emissions factors from a whole host of sources, and thankfully they're already developed for us in most cases. I can't think of one case, but most often you're going to get these factors provided by government agencies like the US EPA, UK government provides it, International Energy Agency. Many countries develop these accounting tools as well and provide this for free as a public service, more or less, for what the emissions factors are relative to what's being consumed in those given regions. So this information is available. You don't have to develop it. I've listed just a couple here. Fuels, things like natural gas, propane, coal, diesel, you name it, it's all there. Purchased energy as well, and then certainly your scope 3 factors. The thing to call out is some of these factors are static for maybe a number of years, 2, 3, 4 years. You might have the same gasoline factor. Science improves, the gasoline mix may change, and so you might see it after a little while, but the factors that change every year are going to be things like electricity. Those have to be updated every year, regardless of your region. In the US, our regions are broken out like this. Okay, this is information produced by the EPA, and they account for every power operator across the United States, what the production is, what the resources going into it, and the emissions factor from that. And so I'm in RMPA, that's the Rocky Mountain region there in blue, and we have a new factor going to come out every year. And I have to make sure that I go get that factor and apply that in my emissions inventory every single year for that update relative to the kilowatt hours. Okay, but it's all available. So thankfully they're doing all of that hard work and all that chemistry for us. All right. We've gotten our resources. We've collected our activity data. We've applied or gathered emissions factors. Now it is pretty basic math. We take our resource use, we multiply by our emissions factor, and we produce now our emissions. Okay, so as you see the example here, 100,000 kilowatt hours multiplied by our emissions, CO2e, carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour consumed, produces 58 metric tons of CO2e for that given period, for that year, let's say. All right, so if we take that and then we kind of come back to our example, looking at the different sources in our scope 1 inventory. We have that vehicle fleet, as you recall, office heating and refrigerants. We have our activity data, gallons, therms, kilograms, multiplied by those specific emissions factors, and we produce our carbon dioxide equivalent. Same in scope 2, and then we total those up. Down in the blue section there, you can see where that scope 1 total is provided and that scope 2 total is provided. This is the most common way to present this information. And the greenhouse gas protocol, which is what this is based on, is used by something in the neighborhood of 95, 96% of global reporting companies. And we're looking at tens of thousands of companies now. I think the last count is somewhere in the neighborhood of 25,000 companies across the globe develop their emissions using this framework. We're going to get to questions here at the end, but that's the basics of developing that first scope 1 and 2 inventory for your operation. Now that we have that, what do we do? Because just developing that information does not inherently decarbonize. We actually need to take action to see some decarbonization across our operations. Planning those emissions reduction activities. So, anybody ski? Anybody? Okay, sweet. All right, we're gonna use a ski metaphor here in just a second. Here is the global emissions going back to 1990. You can see a steady increase all the way up until 2015. Paris Agreement was ratified, and we started now seeing companies understand the level of decarbonization that was required for their own operations. Everybody got a number. Everybody got a rate of decarbonization. That upper blue wedge over here is the 2-degree pathway. That's one we talked about. We want to go faster than that. We want to go steeper than that. That's our green in our skiing parlance, okay? We don't want to ski the greens. We want to go to the next level. That's the blues or the blacks. Maybe we'll just call it the blues here today since it's all blue. That SBT curve that you see there, that's the 1.5-degree pathway. That's the rate of reduction we need to see across the globe in order to mitigate the worst effects and align with 1.5. Okay, and so when we talk about where we need to go and how much we need to decarbonize, that's the curve, the minimum curve we need to achieve. And then, of course, we've got our experts, double blacks, folks achieving net zero in 2030 and so forth, which is going to be a really steep curve there. It's the one that, you know, some of us aspire to ski some days. It's really fun. Anyhow, this is the level of decarbonization we're looking at. And so we take that inventory data and we map it against this in terms of where we need to go. And we do that first by figuring out where our biggest buckets and categories are. Okay, we talked about scope 1, 2, and 3 earlier, and this brings that back together. You can see in the upper right, we've depicted our scope 1 and 2 emissions. The nice thing about scope 1 and 2 is that the mitigation opportunity, which is depicted upon the horizontal axis there, oftentimes that's where some of our highest mitigation opportunity exists in our inventory, is scope 1 and 2. We also have some of the highest primary data. It's coming from utility bills, meter reads, those kind of things. So every kilowatt hour we save has a direct impact on the emissions in our operations or the reduction in the operations. Some of the other categories, we use average data or proxy data, and it's harder to get to some of the mitigation levers that we see in scope 1 and 2. So it's really the perfect place for organizations to start both the accounting and their decarbonization journey. All right. So once we start moving against scope 1 and 2, we have a number of decarbonization strategies to actually get there. We break it up into 3 big buckets. The first is conservation and energy efficiency. So these are things like lighting, HVAC, fuel switching, continuous improvement in operations, right? The nice things about these is that they often produce a positive ROI. So you're going to get paid back on this, okay? The con is it takes sometimes a fairly sophisticated operations team, engineering team to identify these projects, to get them moving and continuously find new projects each year to achieve the rate of decarbonization required. But it's the first place to start. Every kilowatt hour you save, every therm you save there are things you don't have to invest in renewable energy or emissions offsets. So 100% the right way to start. But the next is going to be renewable energy. Renewable energy has a lot of different flavors. I've put a few of those here on the slide. The most, I guess, easily accessed one is going to be this bottom one, energy attribute certificates. Sometimes folks call them RECs, renewable energy credits. That is a North American term. And so that's what we use as the sort of the shorthand there. But across the globe, energy attribute certificates is the umbrella for all of that. They're easy to procure, fairly cost effective, fairly low cost right now. Sometimes there are longer deal terms to them. So you really want to be mindful if you want to get into a 5, 10, 15-year deal with some of these renewable energy options. And then there can be procurement challenges in some markets. Last but not least, we don't deal with emissions offsets all that much, but our emissions offsets. The reporting frameworks that we primarily deal with, and most of the regulatory frameworks out there, don't allow for the accounting of emissions offsets, except for in certain small cases. And so it's really a holdover strategy. I think that they're going to be very much required to achieve net zero across the globe and really hit that final point on where we need to be in 2050. But for the time being, this is not necessarily the primary strategy for most organizations. Those first two, energy efficiency, conservation, and renewable energy, should absolutely be the place that organizations are focusing on for their decarbonization. So how do we rank them? I kind of went through it in the other slide, but scope 1, energy efficiency, start with that. Fuel switching, absolutely. And then emissions offsets. That's going to be your rank order of how you decarbonize your scope 1. Scope 2, energy efficiency. Yet again, the first place we start. Every kilowatt hour saved is one you don't have to buy renewable energy for. But then you do buy renewable energy. Looking at direct through utility purchase programs, what we call a GPP. Environmental attribute certificates. And then last but not least, on-site renewables. Those have gotten significantly more attractive in just the last couple of years. And we expect to increase with that with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States. We're seeing paybacks on those in the matter of like 3 to 4 years. Folks are actually able to make money now on on-site renewables. Historically, that's been 10, 15 years. So really a lot of opportunities there. So we have a framework for thinking about where and how we might reduce. We obviously have our emissions inventory, and then we have the idea of how steeply we have to reduce over time. And so what I'm going to show you here is the way we think about long-term decarbonization. That upper line, that upper curve, is what I would refer to as a business as usual. So for any organization, thinking about where and how you're going to grow and the resources that you're going to consume over time is, in many cases, going to take you up and to the right. You're going to have more square footage, more branches, more electricity consumed, so on and so forth, right? Your emissions are going to grow in the absence of doing anything. Then you have that bottom curve with all the red dots there. That is your rate of decarbonization required for a net zero target by 2040. Yeah, 2040 in this case, right? So that's your blue or black, you got to go ski, but you're going uphill instead. So what are the things we need to do within that big wedge to help us ensure that we're actually going to achieve a long-term target? And that's the type of work that those strategies can come to bear here. And you think about how much each of those strategies can contribute to your long-term decarbonization and building curves like this. Some components may be very small, others much larger, as you see fuel switching here or electrification and renewable energy really taking big chunks out of what your decarbonization journey is going to be. But this mapping of that over the long term is really critical from my perspective in terms of being able to hit those objectives. Just taking it year over year isn't going to work for a long-term pragmatic, cost-effective approach. So these types of curves are really, really helpful for building that. All right. Considering the time, I'm going to move and introduce Paul here as an example of what this looks like for an actual credit union. Paul is from Clearwater Credit Union. He's the Director of Impact and Market Development at Clearwater, where he's been leading the measurement and management of their emissions since 2017. So Paul, are you here? I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Ty. And I'll just move ahead, assuming you all can hear me well. And certainly hats off to the IT team for pulling all of this together. It's run quite smoothly so far. I'll also be moving quite quickly. I'll try and get this done in about 5 minutes. Of course, I'm more than happy to talk with anyone about this afterwards, and my contact information should be pretty available. So if we could move ahead, I think maybe 2 slides, I will dive into it. Let's see, one more past that, please. Terrific. All right, I'll just say briefly about us. Listen, we're a mid-sized credit union, community credit union in a large, very rural state, a northern state with very inexpensive electricity. And we're a strongly values-driven organization. But given our location and the membership we serve, if we can get this done, anybody can. And I included this picture of one of our buildings there because one of the things we've done, even here, not far from Canada, is all of our new build facilities are designed to be net zero energy, as is this one to the right. And you can see the solar panels covering the drive-through there. In fact, we're working on a building now in Uptown Butte, a historic mining town, and that is going to both fit into a historic context, a beautiful architectural historic context, and also be net zero. So if we can do it, you can too. Next slide, please. All right, so thinking about our measurement and management of greenhouse gases, the first point I want to make is that measurement really is the first step. And it sounds like there's a mix of folks in the audience. Some people have already done this, but if you haven't, this really is where you want to start. This is a tremendous amount of information to help plan your reductions. We did this just like Ty described. We followed the greenhouse gas protocol. We sat down, we thought through where our emissions were probably coming from. Then we collected the activity data. In this case, a lot of that is just utility bills, very straightforward. Multiplied that by an emissions factor, and now you get the output. And this is really the bedrock of all of our efforts. There's so much information in here. As an example, you can see our scope 1 and 2 emissions are almost entirely building gas use, building electric use. So right away, if we were coming into this without this information and saying, where do we reduce our emissions? You might think, okay, how about the fleet? Maybe we should be driving all EVs. That's certainly a good thing to do for a lot of reasons. But if you look at the data, that's really not what is driving the bulk of our scope 1 and 2 emissions. Likewise, if we expand this to cover scope 3, there is actually a little sliver up in there for air travel. Of course, this was 21, a little less travel going on, but even if that were to triple, quadruple, you can see that our scope 3 emissions are really being driven by commuting. So we might want to focus on that, rather than some of these other areas. So getting this in hand is really the first thing you want to do, and just sit down and look at it. And it might seem obvious where this is coming from, but to actually have the data is really, really helpful. Next slide, please. So with that in hand, we set goals. To be honest, this goal setting for us was a little more off the cuff. We sat down and just sort of thought through what is going to be reasonable for us to do in a short time frame, with the idea being we're going to try and achieve these goals and then immediately set the next set. So I won't go through these in too much detail, but basically just say the overall goal was to reduce our direct emissions of greenhouse gases, and then use offsets for the rest to get to net zero. The other point I'll make is that with all of these, we wanted to do this in a way that was also being a responsible steward of our members' money. A lot of these things you can spend an arbitrary amount of money on, you can have a lot of fun, you can do very, very cool things, but the payback might not be there. Next slide, please. All right, so this is going to be more on the implementation side. So of course, if you haven't done an inventory, absolutely do that first. Couple cool things here for implementing. The first thing I'll say is that the data shown cover a period when our assets more than doubled. We added, actually even more than this now, something like 30 new full-time equivalent positions, and we opened 3 new branches. Despite that, the graphic I'm showing here actually shows our total scope 1 and 2 emissions. It's not per FTE. It's not per $1 million under management. And the reason for that is that at the end of the day, what's really important is just the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. How much are we putting out there? And so, I'd love to show you that waterfall where this just falls off a cliff, but it's not. It's going down. We're looking at about a 15% reduction in actual emissions, scope 1 and 2, over that period of growth. The way we achieved that was basically we took the lowest hanging fruit first. And for us, that was going to be one, making sure that all of our new facilities were going to be as close to net zero energy as possible. Two, going ahead and just maxing out our solar capacity. So we looked at all of our buildings, we looked at utility policy, building energy use, all things like that, figured out how much solar can we put up, just went ahead and did it. And you can actually do the math, and that correlates almost exactly to the reduction shown. There is a little bit of noise in this because almost all of our scope 1 and 2 emissions are from building energy use. It's quite responsive to environmental conditions. So as the winters are colder or warmer, things like that, the number goes up and down. But short version of that is, for us, easy first step, solar everywhere. Next slide, please. The other thing we did is we do have this commitment to achieving net zero greenhouse gases in our operations, doing that through the use of purchased offsets. Offsets, of course, are a complex topic on their own right. We view them as a necessary short-term stopgap while we work to drive down our actual emissions. One of the ways that we were able to sort of sidestep a lot of the challenges in getting good offset projects is that we have tried to develop these locally. And in this case, we were actually able to do it in partnership with the Missoula Housing Authority and a local climate nonprofit, Climate Smart Missoula, where we funded energy efficiency improvements in income for very low income individuals. So we paid part of the price for heat pumps in exchange for the avoided emissions. We were able to generate about 2 years worth of emissions offsets at a price of about $25 a ton by doing this. Now, these aren't verified, they're not tradable, and we built these basically on trust with our partners and also on being transparent in our calculation methodology, should anybody want to get into it. But this was a really successful project, and we're working on these, developing more of these. So that was a pretty quick case study. I'll leave it there. Happy to entertain questions if we have time. I understand if we don't. And feel free to get in touch with me a little later. Oh, I'm sorry, I'll mention one more thing. Basically, we're going to keep trying to get better at this, one. And two, I've been speaking about our operational greenhouse gas emissions. We do also measure our balance sheet greenhouse gas emissions. Those are about 100 times larger. And we need to figure out what we're going to do about that, to be honest with you. We've just sort of started measuring that, figured out how that works. Haven't set goals yet, but in the long run, looking at those 2030, 2040, 2050 goals, we're going to have to come up with a plan for how we're going to manage balance sheet emissions as well.
Yes. Question is around financed emissions. What tools need to be developed? What frameworks maybe need to be out there to be both quantified and then be able to reduce over time? More or less? Yeah, to direct the types of investments. Yeah. So I mentioned very briefly in the talk about PCAF. That's a framework that is built on the greenhouse gas protocol that gives us very clear guidance by asset class, by invested asset class, what types of data goes into it, and the way that data is manipulated to come up with emissions value. If you're not familiar with PCAF, that's the first place to start. 7 different asset classes covered at this moment, and then a data grade that goes into it. I was chatting with Sophia about this earlier, and she was like, "Got to tell everybody, they don't have to have perfect data. You don't have to have perfect data. There is no perfect data in this space. Scope 1 or 2 or scope 3. It just doesn't exist." I've been working with some companies that have been doing this for 20 years, and they still use estimated data. It is perfectly fine, and it's the right appropriate place to start. And I think in the scope 3 space, the investment space, it's the same way. You're going to have to figure out some average data to use to deploy against the types of vehicles that are maybe you're loaning against, the types of houses that you're providing mortgages against, and some smart groupings for that relate to the way that you're making those investments, where they're coming from, where they are in the world, or where they are in the United States. And again, PCAF gives us the tools to do it. The benchmarks for energy consumption and thereby emissions, I think there's a whole host of places. I'm happy to chat with you about this later on. We've got I won't acronym soup you here, but there's a whole host of benchmarks and kind of come out there and talk about how energy is being consumed in vehicles and homes and commercial buildings, you name it, it's all there. Take some work, but what we have found in doing the invested emissions is that the first year is the biggest lift. It's the place you're going to spend the most time trying to figure out how is our data structured? Do we get everything? Okay. Once you have that, then each subsequent year gets a lot easier, right? New investments in there, still use the same data framework, same data structures. You're just improving maybe the data quality in some aspects or including the different asset classes in there. Once you have that, that's the first step in figuring out then where the biggest buckets are, where the biggest emissions are, obviously, and then thinking about relative to how you invest, where you want to be 5, 10, 15 years down the road, right? So maybe that is things like Paul talked about, how are we making mortgages or loans against energy efficiency projects, against renewable energy projects, and being able to take account for that in that same way. But yeah, getting the data, it starts, and depending upon the structure of that data is, you can really kind of get there quickly, or it takes a little bit more doing.
Any other questions? We still have the room for a moment.
I heard a question earlier, and Paul, maybe if you're still there, love your thinking on this. How do you get C-suite or leadership buy-in for some of the initiatives that you developed for your reduction strategy? I'll take that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and it's a good point too, and it's one you hear a lot, but it's absolutely true. Is having management support for this is really critical. And certainly as I have gone around the credit union and into the business lines and asked them for data and asked them for time, having that clear direction that this is something we want to do was really helpful. In some ways, I'm not equipped to answer the question because I came into this with a board and a management team that was already strongly on board. So, how to make that case to them, I'm not so sure, but I will say that one of the things maybe buried in one of my slides there was over that 6-year period we've been measuring our greenhouse gases, our balance sheet has more than doubled in size. And in fact, all of our financial metrics have been well above peer during that period of time. And we attribute that to successfully and clearly basing our corporate strategy around shared values. And one of those is to use finance for good, to use our members' money for good. And that includes reducing our environmental impact. So we've been very straightforward that this is who we are, and this is what we're doing. And we've certainly seen that be rewarded from the membership in our financial performance.